Throughout Canadian history, non-Indigenous researchers carry out the majority of research in Indigenous communities through a colonial lens. The result of this relationship means that Indigenous people have largely been studied at rather than studied with. Through our presentation, we hope to take on a decolonial lens and challenge Western epistemology as the leading theoretical skeleton waiting for Indigenous data to be tested and proved. Canadian government in 2016 published a Truth and Reconciliation Report to increase funding for child welfare and education in order to protect the culture of Indigenous communities. Since then, there has been more and more interest within academia to conduct research in aid of Indigenous people. When Dan Hunar, in Chapter 4 of Text, states that researchers have been increasingly relying on OCAP, a set of Indigenous-centered guidelines outlining the implications of academic research when intersecting with Indigenous spiritual values deeply grounded in a relationship with nature and to a collective life. This section of the text provides an excellent foreground of the often conflicting worldview that a non-Indigenous researcher may encounter in their work. In this presentation, however, we explore the positionality of non-Indigenous researcher when entering an Indigenous space, and the very limitation of this positionality in Indigenous research. Given the history of researchers flying in to conduct a research and flying out when they're done collecting data, purposeful and lasting engagement as an ally of the community is a key indicator of success that Killian noted in his study. The goal of qualitative research is to seek rich and in-depth data. Killian highlights the importance of building trusting relationship well before entering community as a good way to achieve this goal. Researchers need to give themselves ample time to understand the lived reality of Indigenous community and ensure that research question is relevant and generated by the community. Central to this perspective is the belief that given adequate relationship development, well-intentioned allyship will enable non-Indigenous scholars to better navigate relevant ethical concerns. Almerston, a member of the Tlingit clan in northern BC in contrast, argues that Western academia needs to challenge the belief that non-Aboriginal researchers can adequately capture and portray a culture different from theirs. In his exploration of Indigenous way of conducting research, he notes that respect for Indigenous knowledge starts with Indigenous communities providing the standard for research and ensuring that this Indigenous framework is followed throughout research stages. Central to his argument is that Indigenous people often hold knowledge and values that lead them to provide their own solutions. Part of reconceptualizing research from an Indigenous perspective is for non-Indigenous researchers to recognize that there are multiple truths depending on perspectives, which he notes that many non-Indigenous researchers understandably often struggle to reconcile. Decolonial theory scholar William Trout argues that it is important for researchers to employ decolonial theory as a framework, emphasizes to give Indigenous communities the space to recover from the traumatic impacts of colonialism. Researchers therefore can better counter their bias and portray a different cultural image from another perspective. Non-Indigenous researchers using the decolonial framework seek to bring community members together by acknowledging their collecting strength and abilities. By taking a step back from the research, a decolonial research process invites participants to share their own knowledge and determine if research data is representative to their experiences and community. Decolonial framework thus invites self-determined community actions, meaning that the framework does not direct next steps for participants, but rather understand Indigenous community is capable of determining the appropriate action for themselves. With reference to the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Section B, non-Indigenous researchers have to go beyond ensuring the three main ethics principles expected of every research design: justice, respect for persons, and concern for welfare, and consider additional ethical elements like relevance of their research question to the community they're working with and engaging with the principle of reciprocity. Moreover, non-Indigenous researchers need to recognize that research is a highly institutionalized process ingrained within fields of knowledge, scholars and their choice of research methods, and influenced by interests of academia itself. As scholars train in institutionalized practices, there is an ever more need for researchers to be reflexive of the assumption and perspectives that they carry when building relationship with indigenous communities. At times, non-indigenous researchers need to recognize limitations to their own positionality and consider alternative research design such that they step back from the role of principal investigator to better support Indigenous involvement throughout the research process. One of the heated debate we had within our group was why there are few Indigenous scholars to study their own community. From our discussion earlier, we noted that non-Indigenous scholars fundamentally do not share the same positionality and lived experience as Indigenous community. A solution here would therefore be academia to incorporate equitable hiring practices of Indigenous scholars in respective departments. But the reality is that there are very few Indigenous PhD students, so we then thought supporting Indigenous students at an undergraduate level to become experts in their respective field would be a solution that makes sense. But then we now recognize the term expert carries the assumption that Indigenous people have to try to achieve certain credentials granted by a colonial institution like academia in order to conduct legitimate research on their community. And moreover, does academia have the capacity to train and support non-orthodox ways of knowing? And whether or not they will be open to other epistemology to be normalized as an acceptable research standard. In addition, thinking about how peer-reviewed journals are published, there is no space for non-credential individuals to share their research and findings. In response to this reality, we see that Indigenous communities create their own subaltern space for dialogue, sharing, and participate in counter discourses. The concerns we flag here is the concern of whether or not Indigenous scholars can change a system from within, without the willingness of the system itself to compromise its values and adapt to a new norm. The answer we reach is no. However, we would also like to highlight a similarity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers in terms of the similar concern they might face, which is that both researchers need to acknowledge and adapt to different contexts depending on the Indigenous group they're working with. Breaking free from a colonial conception of Indigenous people as a homogeneous group of people is a struggle that Ormiston, the Indigenous scholar we cited earlier, struggled with as well. The debate on how non-Indigenous researchers can enter Indigenous community at its core is rested on the fact that research is a validated and legitimized way of knowing in institutions like academia. Non-Indigenous researchers need to recognize that the status they're entering community with is not only rooted in the present, but also rooted in a fractured relation of trust with the Indigenous community from the past. The attention to social justice, we argue, is inseparable for a non-Indigenous researcher to consider in drafting of their research design from the beginning. Whether that means a longer timeline of relationship building with the community, taking a step back as the principal investigator, or leveraging their own privileges and positionality to be an ally of the community after publication in order to build a long-term trusting relationship. All of these are significant steps for non-Indigenous researchers as they try to make amends with historical and current injustices. In addition, we hope through our presentation to shine lights on the different implications for an Indigenous student and individuals to be expected to acquire certain credential in order to conduct legitimate research of their community. Our attention to this issue was not an attempt to disregard the role of research ethic boards and other potential concern for a contextualized approach when interacting with different Indigenous communities. But rather, Indigenous scholars don't have the space within the current academic system to explore nuanced epistemology due to the system's reluctance for change.